in this lecture, we are going to discuss interest groups. And of course, interest groups are very much linked to collective action. As we'll see, understanding when groups can overcome a collective action problem is really critical to understanding where there are interest groups for certain interests and where there aren't. And as we'll think about, there are actually a lot of political interests that you can think of that are perhaps very underrepresented in terms of formal interest group organizations, and often that means that they are underrepresented in terms of policy. And indeed, to look at our textbook's definition of what an interest group is to begin with, we see that Shively saying that interest groups are all about policies. He says that an interest group is an organized group of citizens whose central political goal is to ensure that the state follows certain policies. And as an example of that, let's think about one of the most famous and influential interest groups in the American political system, and that's, of course, this group here, the National Rifle Association, the NRA. Now, they are a very organized group of citizens, and they have the central political goal of expanding and preserving gun rights and advocating issues that are really important to people like hunters and issues like self-defense, of course. On the other side, you'll often have interest groups that face off against one another. There's another pretty large interest group, certainly not as influential as the NRA. But that would be Everytown for Gun Safety, right? And the Brady Campaign and lots of other interest groups that are sort of on the other side of this issue from the NRA. They are really focused upon ensuring that the state restricts the ownership of firearms, or at least put certain criteria, standards, practices, and procedures upon that. And so here we see examples of interest groups on the issue of sort of gun rights or gun safety, but we can talk about interest groups that span all sorts of different interests. Now, there's probably an interest group for any sort of issue you could think of. However, we can see a lot of variation in the degree of their influence, and that's really linked to the degree of their institutionalization. How big is this group? How formalized? How many resources does it have? And members, things like that. And so we'll see that some interest groups are incredibly powerful. And groups that we see here, like the American Civil Liberties Union, is a very institutionalized group. They have existed for a long time. They have a large staff. They conduct research. They have connections both in the government, right? They do all sorts of stuff. The AARP, the American Association of Retired People, right? This is another major interest group that makes sure that the state pursues policies that favor the elderly, right? And of course, the Sierra Club on a national and world scale pursues environmental causes. Here locally, we have the San Juan Citizens Alliance that works on these issues. And so we see that there are tons of different interest groups, some of them extremely, extremely influential, like the NRA or the AARP, some of them less so. And that variation is what we are interested in. But first, let's talk about what interest groups do. Why do we care about interest groups as a variable? What do they accomplish in society? Well, the most basic role that they have is representing certain groups. And in particular, going back to Shively's definition that an interest group is an organized group of people concerned with making sure the state follows certain policies, interest groups are working to represent groups of people in terms of the policy making of the state. The American Nurses Association, for example, is working to ensure the state pursues policies that are beneficial to that trade. Same with the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, right? This is a much smaller interest group than perhaps the NRA or the AARP, but of course this is a group that is trying to make sure that the Colorado government and other levels of government are pursuing policies that are friendly to the oil and gas industry. We can talk, and of course they probably face off against the San Juan Citizens Alliance when it comes to certain issues about drilling in certain places, for example. And so interest groups are very broadly meant to take a group of people and represent them. It can be trade or industries. It can be ideological. It can be based on race, ethnicity, gender, age, really any sort of identity. And of course, we've seen how fluid identities are, and interest groups can represent any person for any sort of identity. And a major role that they play is specifically lobbying. Now, lobbying is that process of going to government and working to convince representatives, bureaucracies, anybody with political power over the issue that the interest group is really concerned with. They're going to go and try and convince them to pursue certain policies. And so you can imagine the NRA and Everytown both are sending lots of people to Congress, to state houses, to different bureaucracies in order to try and convince them of the best policy. And of course, the best policy is going to be very different from the perspective of the NRA and Everytown. But they are lobbying. They're working to represent their members, the groups of people in society that find these issues very important to them. And that's what lobbying means. Now, lobbying has sort of a negative meaning, a negative connotation a lot of the time. Lobbyist is almost a dirty word. And that's often because of the idea that lobbyists are, the representative of people with big money in government instead of every person. And we're going to return to that theme. But on a basic level, lobbying is really about representing the people. It's about people coming together, acting collectively, right? Performing collective action in order to pool their resources, pool their voices, pool their financial resources, their organizational resources in order to influence lawmakers so that they can get the policies that are most important to them passed, so that they can see that the use of the state's sovereign authority is in line with their interests, their group. Another major role here is holding elected officials accountable. So they play a pretty important role in the accountability structures of democracy. Here we're returning to the case of the NRA, the National Rifle Association, and the NRA's, and the PVF here, this is the Political Victory Fund, right? And you can at any time go to this website and conduct a search, and of course this is, they won't have any elections going on as I shoot this, but, or not many at least, but you can click any election that's coming up, and they will provide a ranking or a grade of each candidate on the issue of gun rights and the Second Amendment. So they will go out, do that hard research to say, okay, where do all of these candidates stand? Where have they voted? What have they said? All of that sort of stuff, and they will compile a report. That means if you are an NRA member, you can go and see which candidate is more in line with your thinking and your preferences on that issue, which is a really great way for accountability to happen. Of course, it can also change the incentives of our elected representatives. If you are a senator or a congressperson, you will think about how different organizations might react and what they might say about you, what message they might convey to their membership and to the media about you. So, candidates will go out of their way to try and get endorsements from organizations like the NRA. And of course, not just the NRA, this happens all over the place. You can also get environmental ratings on different candidates from organizations like the Sierra Club. You can get policy briefs, all sorts of things. And indeed, a related role that interest groups play is conducting research. Interest groups are actually really important for policy research. They, especially the larger, more institutionalized and more organized groups, conduct all sorts of research. They have staffs of experts on these policies. People who have made their careers in certain policy areas, people who maybe have studied it academically, legally, or even worked in policy implementation. And so here we see an example closely following the election in 2016 by the Kaiser Family Foundation, which is an interest group and sort of a think tank, which is a think tank you can sometimes think of as a type of interest group, right? And they deal with all sorts of issues pertaining to U.S. healthcare. And so they're saying, well, here are some places that we can get information about Donald Trump's stance on healthcare reform, and they'll put out articles like that to inform people and conduct educational campaigns. Now, it's important to note that it's not just the public they're informing; they're also informing a lot of policymakers. And a really good example of that is the Paris Climate Agreement. Actually, a lot of the basic plans of the Paris Climate Agreement came out of different interest groups, environmental interest groups, and think tanks. And so once the parties to the agreement, the governments of the world, the US government, the Chinese government, sort of said, well, here are the basic contours, the basic sketch or outline of our agreement. It it was the interest groups that actually came in and said, okay, well, if you want to achieve these broad goals, here are the specific policies, the nitty-gritty nuts and bolts. That's the sort of thing that a lot of interest groups do. In doing this research and trying to advocate for certain policies or certain causes and trying to educate both the public and policymakers about specific aspects of their policy goals, interest groups perform this really vital role of working to educate and even increase participation. And so we can see that interest groups are often maligned, lobbyists, big money, etc., but they also perform really important roles in increasing participation and increasing voter education and information, which we've seen can be quite low. And of course, in forming that line of vertical accountability by telling the people what their elected officials are doing on a certain issue by making that information available. Of course, going back to the paradox of voting, it can be very costly for individual voters to go out and research every single specific issue, every single candidate on every issue, and so interest groups perform a pretty vital role for that.